Welcome to another episode of Voices in Digital Theology, sponsored by the Global Network for Digital Theology. My name is Catherine Schmidt. I'm Assistant Professor of Theology at Malloy College in New York. And with me is Jonas Kroberg, Deputy Director for the Center for Digital Theology. Hi, Jonas.
Hi, good to see you, Catherine.
Good to see you.
Today we have Dr. Hanna Reichel with us, who is the Associate Professor in Reformed Theology at Princeton Seminary. It's a great pleasure to have you here, and we look forward to our conversation. Hanna, will you tell us a little bit about your academic background, and then maybe a little bit something, or what sparked your interest in this area of theology and digitality?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hi, Jonas. Hi, Catherine. It's good to see you. And then thank you for having me. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to reflect on digital theology together, because I'm also still not sure altogether what it means. So this is an ongoing conversation. My own background is really very much in traditional systematic theology. I was trained in Germany. I studied in Bonn, in Heidelberg, also in Lebanon for a time, in Beirut. I did my dissertation on Karl Barth's use of confessional documents, and tried to frame him there as a contextual theologian in the way that he uses confessions. And I have always been interested in kind of questions that sit at the intersection of theology and then maybe political questions, questions of power, contextual things that has also to do with my own biographic background. I suppose I've moved around or with my family a bit. I've lived in very different places and have always been curious how that kind of impacts even our conceptions and the kind of work we do. Yeah, I have 3 siblings who work in computer science. I myself, this is really not my field. I'm kind of interested in the power dynamics and the ways in which technologies structure our life together. And this is kind of the angle from which I came to it. Yeah, when I tell people that I work on theologies of the digital, they often tend to think that it's about, or I'm talking about like using technologies in theological teaching and research. I think you all also get that a lot. I found it very helpful the way you also parsed it out, right, in different meanings of digital theology. But I kind of tend to get that often as a kind of first reaction. So digital humanities and pedagogy questions. And of course, I've also dabbled in some of that a bit. You all know that I'm also involved with an online journal, Cursor, that's trying to use the discursive participatory potentials of online media for a different kind of academic culture as well in publishing. We're working together with the Knowledge Future group of MIT there. I'm also with a couple of colleagues working on a conception of what we call citizen theology. That's kind of borrowing conceptions from citizen science. So it's somewhere between digital epistemology and participatory research, trying to bridge discourses between experts and lay people, leveraging again already existent digital cultures, which exist, right, as epistemic communities also for the doing of theology. Incorporating kind of principles of open access, free open source software movements, and issues of global justice for theological and church discourses. So I mean, there are some fields where I'm also thinking about how we use technologies in theological work. Yeah.
Can I just interrupt with a little question? That's a lot of things that you engage with. It's great. But you mentioned this phrase, theologies of the digital. And do you think that you're using that slightly different to what maybe the group that we kind of represent have been using digital theology?
Probably, yeah. Or maybe in one of the ways in which you parse it out, the different meanings. When I say theologies of the digital, I basically mean looking at digital phenomena through a theological lens and analyzing them in this way. And so for me, in that sense, it's maybe a subfield of something like political theology, also in a very distinct meaning. I know political theology is used in a lot of ways. But so, yeah, I also work on a book, which we were talking about earlier, that I call Political Theologies of Omniscience. And here I'm kind of trying to use theological conceptions, right? Omniscience as a category from the doctrine of God, as a lens through which to read contemporary phenomena, which of course are different, right? This is not about God. This is about things that people do and people invent, and how people communicate with each other, or store information or whatever. But kind of wagering that some of the conceptions that theologians have developed can also be applied here and could be helpful resources for analysis.
So it's primarily thinking of theology as an interpretive lens. Is that how you?
Yeah, why not?
Okay. I have another question about your biography, and it has to do with Barth and Barthians. And so I'm just wondering, my suspicion, maybe this is wrong, but my suspicion is that you see all of the things that you're looking at now, this idea of omniscience in terms of the digital, and so we're going to talk about predictive modeling in a minute, but I'm guessing that you see those things as continuous with all of the things that you were doing with the Karl Barth stuff. So is that fair to say, first of all? And if so, what's kind of the, are you making any headway with people who study Karl Barth, I guess, in terms of seeing this as a continuous project?
Yeah, I've also, especially since moving contexts a few times, realized that there are very different versions of Karl Barth around, and that I don't always recognize who people talk about, and they don't always recognize who I talk about when I say Barth. So for me, Barth as a theologian represents also a kind of theology that is very much actively engaged in thinking through contemporary matters, specifically also political matters, and does not compartmentalize theology as a field that should only be occupied with things that have nothing to do with the world, but as a kind of theology that wagers, if you do theology proper, it will also really have something to say for all these other things, because it's all the same reality. Yeah.
So as I mentioned, the thing that I have to admit, I'm a little bit sad that it's taken me this long to become aware of you and your work. This is all Newness introduced me to you, and I'm very grateful for that. And one of the things that caught my eye as I've been looking at some of your work is this focus on predictive modeling. And you know, I kind of came at it as an interest through kind of predictive policing, actually, in the United States. But can you give us a sense of how you would take something like predictive modeling and talk about it theologically? You've kind of given us a sense of your methodology, but can you kind of perform it for us? Show us what that looks like?
I don't know.
Sorry.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, right, this is another thing I encounter often, that when I engage with specific technologies or topics like that people then, the other reaction that I get, if it's not digital humanities, then it must be digital ethics. So is predictive modeling good or bad? Can you tell us now? And yeah. And I try to hold off of that as much as I can. First of all, because I'm not an ethicist, like this is just not my expertise. And I don't want to make, also I don't know enough about the technologies, the policies around them, all the different factors that a real ethicist would have to weigh when making recommendations. And then of course also maybe some ethicists would say what they do is maybe not even about recommendations. That's a different matter. But as a theologian, and with maybe the spin you gave it earlier, Jonas, I'm maybe engaging more in a kind of a conceptual modeling. Like I'm trying to build models of God and the world and human beings and how it all fits together, and what changes when we configure these models differently, when we think differently about these kinds of things. So, I mean, something like predictive modeling, for me as a theologian, it kind of strikes the bell of, as theologians, we've been thinking about a question like, if someone knows everything about you, what happens to your freedom? Can this person even predict your future? And if such a prediction is possible, does that then actually mean that you're free or unfree to not do as is predicted? Things like that. So theologians have been asking these kinds of questions for a long time. Of course, they have been asking that about God. But I think that, I mean, and in that sense, it's also theoretical and speculative debates to some degree. But now we kind of, maybe for the first time, have technological developments and societal developments that give us something like a concrete idea of what these speculative and theological models look like on the ground, how they play out. And as a theologian, I'm now interested in two things. Like, one, can some of the discourses, debates that have evolved around God's foreknowledge and how it impacts human freedom, can they be mapped onto some of the debates that we're leading here? If so, can they even be helpful as a resource to kind of discern certain questions that could be asked? Maybe, you know, we already have an array of answers for specific questions, or we have concepts or categories for some of the things that have to be interrogated. And maybe in that sense, theology could kind of provide some resources, hermeneutical resources, to the kind of analysis that needs to go on here. On the other hand, maybe some of these concrete manifestations of such a apparently at first glance superhuman power that impacts, you know, how you move, how your future will be decided, things like that, might also prompt us as theologians to go back and look again at the kind of conceptions of God that we have been talking about, and see whether we actually also have to revise some of them. So maybe here an analogy would be right after the especially after the Second World War, Holocaust, but also from feminist analyses, from decolonial analyses, and so forth. We have a lot of interrogations of conceptions of divine power. When kind of people first saw, like, now we have a concrete manifestation of what sovereign power plays out materially, and suddenly conceptions that are used to be very interesting in the doctrine of God, but also quite abstract, we kind of see ramifications to them that we were not able to see earlier on. And then suddenly, in light of these concrete manifestations that are not divine, very much not divine, theologians go back and say, well, maybe we should not talk about divine power in terms of sovereignty, maybe we should talk about it in terms of solidarity, in terms of weakness, in terms of different other things, and even revisit their own traditional stuff. Again, now, again, doesn't have anything to do anymore with the concrete political realities, but so the dialogue can go both ways, or the prompts that could maybe be helpful could go both ways to kind of offer a new lens for construction.
One of the things that we've been asking and been discussing in some of these interviews is does digital technology represents something fundamentally new in the history of technology? So throughout history, we see quite a close correlation between theology and technology in various ways, and practices of the church and worship and so forth. Do you think this is just a continuation of history of technology and religion, or technology and theology? Or does the digital kind of represent something very different?
Yeah, good question. Yes and no, probably. And also it depends, the typical answers. It depends, of course, how you define the digital. Yes, I think like in the massive scope and scales, and the rapid transformations of so many aspects of life, I think there is something new there. But there's also, of course, a lot of continuity with earlier trajectories. So, I mean, the moment that my interest first got sparked in digital technologies, and specifically surveillance technologies, was kind of in the context of the Occupy movement, the Arab Spring risings, the Snowden revelations, where I felt that people, maybe people were not noticing for the first time, but there was kind of a push, right, in public perception, and even in fields like theology, where they had not really traditionally engaged with that all that much. And I was struck by two things. One was that we don't really, at the time, I felt we didn't have in theology good conceptualizations for what was happening through technology here. And so that was an aspect of newness, right? So we tried to map it onto political ethics or economics and so forth. And some of these categories have traction, or media ethics. But then there's also new stuff going on, right? The solution between public and private sphere, the way in which these things both can empower and endanger people in radical ways, the different kinds of movements that were rising. So yeah, and I feel like in that moment and in many other moments, right, there's always this tendency to either like there's a big hype and an enthusiasm and like this is the brave new world and this, it makes participation and democracy and all that possible and access to information, and it will revolutionize all our societies in such great ways. Will make them more egalitarian and more democratic and whatever. And of course, we have also seen several waves of deflation of these expectations. And on the other side, we always have the dystopian alarmist visions, right? Big Brother is watching you, and the total mind control. And I find both lenses unsatisfactory, even as I find myself falling into them as well as any other person probably every now and then. But so I'm also wary whether the category of newness itself doesn't kind of trigger both overblown expectations and overblown fears. And I really like very much a quote by Gilles Deleuze, who, I think this is actually in his fragment on the societies of control, says, there's no need for hope or fear, only to look for new weapons. So, right, some of these emotions are very high blown, but maybe a little more underwhelming analysis could help more discern what is going on. The other thing that I really like is Melvin Kranzberg's first theorem: technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And I'm really interested in the way in which the technologies are not neutral. And I'm using technology in a very wide sense here, maybe even a Foucauldian, right? It's not just the individual, like the algorithm or this kind of program, but how patterns and assemblages structure our moving and thinking and behaving and interacting in our whole culture and thinking in different ways. So, and here I feel that there is something that is really different in digital technologies, even as it has a larger trajectory, right? We have always been trying to keep track of information. We have always been measuring and counting in different ways, and there have been different ways to do that. But maybe like digitization at a very basic level is here more than any of the particular tools and technologies that kind of build on them. I think is so powerful because it's kind of at the level of invention of language or money. It's kind of a different way of rendering reality altogether that can then be applied to anything. And it can make everything commensurable in this new information that then is information. And then so many things can happen, right? And I feel this is where something new, like a new layer or a new like lens or world-making technology is really coming into play here. And which at the same time then becomes or generates elements within that reality and interacts with it in ways that also shape and transform them.
Yeah, I think that was reading one of your texts just now before that's kind of what struck me was potentially interesting here, is thinking about digitality not as much as technological artifacts, but maybe as language and linguistic terms. What do you think what might be the implications then for theology itself? I don't know if you're able to answer that, but.
Yeah, I mean, there's interesting strands even in philosophy that think about like, what does it mean about and physics, right? About the nature of the universe is, do we maybe even live in a reality that is at a basic level constituted informationally? Is our ontology an informational one, and even a digital one? Because then the question is also, right, are things continual, or are they kind of digitally atomized? And what does that mean then? And we have maybe here another kind of loop back to classical theological themes, like, do we live in the mind of God, which like acquires a new dimension. It's not just a speculative question, but it then has it gives new meanings to this question of how do we see divine and human power and knowledge interact in making worlds, and kind of also allowing for the specific kinds of connections that then become possible and probable in these worlds, and where does that lead down the road?
So my suspicion is that a lot of people want you to kind of go into ethics when you're starting to talk about some of these things. And so I'm wondering if you think, first of all, why do you think that is? Why do you think that our impulse is always to kind of put these questions into the category of ethics? And then kind of the sort of church question, do you think it's possible for the church, however we want to conceive of it, to move beyond seeing the internet or seeing, digital technology as good, bad, and also neutral? You know what I'm saying? Like, is there a way, do you have hope that we're able to kind of, take seriously basically what you're suggesting about, ways of theologizing that come out of our cultural context?
Yeah, so first the ethics question, and then you have to circle me back to the other one as necessary. I mean, I think it's utterly understandable that, because these are ethical questions, of course. In real life, when we are confronted with technologies, it's mostly in concrete scenarios, and then we have to make concrete choices, or we are actually often aware that we're not even able to make concrete choices, and that also worries us, right? So that is, of course, absolutely understandable and legitimate and very necessary to treat this as an issue of ethics. What should I do? Should I install this app? Should I not? In the pandemic, for example, right? What are the costs and benefits of giving people access to my information? Of course, we have to make these choices and to think about them. I think it's very difficult to make good choices. And it's also, in the concrete situations, they're always already pre-structured so much. So I'm much interested in kind of taking a step back to understanding at a more general level things that then will become relevant in the concrete situations, but also help us to look beyond them, because the individual choice, I feel like, is always there's always not really much of a choice. And it's probably also at a societal level more important, or also important, to think about what concrete choices do we want to generate, rather than only deciding the ones that we already have. And I think it's understandable. I feel I still need to do more understanding, more analysis before I want to go to ethics. The other thing is that I feel there's a tendency in theology. I mean, of course, there's always a technophobic tendency that I also feel in myself every now and then. And there's also a tendency, which I really don't like, that's kind of, so why God sees me anyway, so why does it even matter that Google sees me too? Or at the end of the day, God knows me better than whoever ever can. And I also understand that very much as a pastoral concern, but it's also very naive, and I feel it's a problematic use of theology to kind of gloss over the real transformations and then point to a greater reality. So I'd rather use theology kind of as an analytic and hermeneutical tool to expose how some of these things work, rather than giving people the comfort of answers.
Yes. Go ahead, Joan.
So this probably bridges to your second question, right? I mean, of course, pastors have to do that. I'm also in the very privileged position of not having to provide concrete answers every now and then. I mean, I hope that this kind of, it can also be a division of works. I don't want to either absolve myself or say this other work is less important. Maybe these can also play together in a distinct kind of way. I hope so.
So you mentioned early on the project understanding kind of, I don't know, maybe I'm having to paraphrase this because I can't remember exactly how you said it, but talking about the theology of kind of ordinary people, or I don't know, maybe phrase it differently. So I guess that leads me to a kind of question about what is the relation with digital theology and academic theology? How should we understand that? It's something, yeah.
In what sense of digital theology are you using it now?
Well, I guess I'm thinking about both kind of theological method and that kind of reciprocal conversation between digitality and digital and theology. Is the digital just another topic that we study as theologians?
Yeah, I mean, I said earlier, I understand it maybe as a subfield of political theology. So in one sense, it could be a topic that we study. At the same time, it's also a reality in which we live. And so I maybe, and the digital theology in that sense is also much more a lived theology. And I understand this academic reflection maybe as this space of taking a step back and thinking critically about it, analyzing some of the implicit assumptions that we inhabit or we already construct all the time in our digital life. Because when we relate to each other in particular ways, when we use technologies that give a certain shape to our relationships, to our church council meetings, to whatever, like it generates specific forms in which we relate to each other, and it comes with basically assumptions that then inform how we relate these things, like what we think of God, what we think of power, what we think of each other, of the role of the human being, of what we understand community to be. And so again, I would see the academic theology as a kind of exercise and reflection on the implicit theologies that are already there in the digital lives that we lead, that can then both lead to, like, we can formulate it maybe better, what is already there, but it can also help us to sometimes ask, is this precisely the way in which we want to do these things? Do we want to do it a bit differently? Or also, on the other hand, right, do we want to change our theoretic, dogmatic formulations in light of the realities in which we already live that maybe don't always necessarily directly map onto the things that we say theologically?
Well, I know you've given me a lot to think about. I'm sure Jonas would say the same. Unfortunately, we have to let you go, but thank you so much. I know that we are very much looking forward to everything that you'll produce in the future. I think it's going to be really super exciting. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. And I'm really excited about the network you're building, because this is the other thing, right? It's even as things are new and old and ongoing and also hard to keep up with, and people work on them in so many different areas, disciplines, corners of the world. It's awesome that you are giving us some ways to connect and to know of each other.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks for your contribution.